My daughter's voice echoed in my skull as I pushed open the door. Enjoy the termites. 3 days since the will reading, the hinges didn't creak. The floor didn't sag. I stepped inside and stopped. Polished hardwood caught the light. Clean windows framed the lake. On the kitchen table sat 2 white mugs, steam rising, a small vase of fresh trillium between them. Someone had been living here, and they were expecting me. Quick moment, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I love knowing where you're all tuning in from. My name is Clive Thornbury. I'm 58 years old, and I've spent 33 of those years married to a woman who stopped looking at me 6 months before she died. To understand what I lost, you need to understand what I built. And to understand that, you need to meet my father. Curtis Thornbury finished the boathouse in the summer of 1962. I was 4 years old, barely tall enough to see over his workbench, but he'd pull me up onto a stool and let me watch. He'd cut dovetail joints by hand while I held the wood steady, my small fingers learning the grain before I could spell my own name. You can tell a man's character by how he treats the parts no one will ever see, he'd say, fitting 2 pieces together so tight you couldn't slide paper between them. The back of a drawer, the underside of a table, what you do when nobody's looking, that's who you are. 40 years later, I still check the back of every drawer I build. By 16, I could identify any wood species by smell alone. Oak has a vanilla sweetness. Walnut carries something almost bitter. American chestnut, the kind harvested before the blight killed 4 billion trees, smells like honey and moss. My father kept samples from every project he completed, small blocks stored in labeled drawers. 400 pieces, 400 memories. I inherited that collection when he died. It was the only thing he left me that mattered. I met Meredith in 1992 at Hawkins Antiques in Burlington. She'd brought in her grandmother's secretary desk for restoration, mahogany veneer lifting along the writing surface. One of the tambour slats cracked, the brass hardware tarnished black. Most restorers would have stripped it, refinished it, made it look new. I showed her how to save the patina instead. We talked for 3 hours that first day. She understood the desk's real value, not market price. The hands that had touched it across 3 generations. Her grandmother had written love letters at that desk during the war. Her mother had paid bills there every Sunday morning. The scratches and ink stains weren't damage. They were history. Meredith looked at my calloused hands and didn't flinch. She asked about my father's techniques, about the joinery in the boathouse, about what made old-growth lumber different from plantation wood. Most people glazed over when I talked about craft. She leaned forward. We married 8 months later. The next 3 decades, I built things. That's what I do. Meredith managed our finances while I restored homes for Vermont's old families. She'd negotiated our mortgage down twice, caught billing errors I never would have seen. We bought a colonial revival on 3 acres of lakefront property when our daughter Kristen was 2, 6,000 square feet of neglected grandeur. And I spent 15 years bringing it back to life. Every mantel in that house I carved myself. Cherry wood in the living room, with a vine pattern I copied from a photograph of the original. White oak in the study, simpler lines, because the room's proportions demanded restraint. I laid every floor by hand, matching the original random width boards I salvaged from a demolished barn in Stowe. I replaced the rotted sill plates without disturbing the plaster above. I reglazed 400 window panes. The house became my signature project. Museum directors brought visitors to see my millwork. Other restorers asked how I'd managed the curved staircase balustrade without a single visible seam. Meredith handled the money. I never questioned her choices. She paid the bills, invested our savings, dealt with the accountants. Numbers weren't my language. My father had worked the same way with my mother, and it seemed natural that I would too. Kristen arrived in 1993, 10 pounds, 2 ounces, with her mother's sharp features and my stubborn streak. I built her crib from Vermont maple, designed it to convert into a toddler bed, then a headboard she could use into adulthood. I carved her initials into the footboard with a small chisel, taking 6 hours to get the serifs right. She slept in that crib until she was 3. I don't know what happened to it after she outgrew it. The distance started small, private school friends with different expectations. Equestrian lessons where fathers wore blazers instead of flannel. By the time she turned 17, Kristen had stopped inviting me to her events. Her debutante ball I found out about from Meredith 3 days before. "You don't have to come," Kristen said when I asked about it. "It's not really your scene." I went anyway. Wore my best suit, the one I saved for estate auctions. Stood in the back of the ballroom while daughters paraded past on their father's arms. The orchestra played something classical. My collar felt too tight. When Kristen's turn came, she smiled for the cameras, then found an excuse to move away before I could reach her. Her eyes kept drifting to my hands. Bradley Walsh, the man who would become my son-in-law, arrived 2 years later. Connecticut money, investment banking, a family compound in Greenwich. He shook Meredith's hand when Kristen brought him home for Thanksgiving. When I extended mine, he nodded and turned away. At the wedding, he introduced me to his parents as the craftsman who'd done some work on the family home. His mother smiled politely and asked if I had a card. I didn't correct him. Kristen's dinner parties never included me. Her Greenwich friends knew about her mother, but I was a shadow in the family portrait, someone to be explained away if I accidentally appeared. Bradley referred to me as the handyman at a charity auction where one of my restored tables sold for $40,000. Meredith noticed she had to, but she never said anything, and I took her silence as agreement. Maybe she was embarrassed too. Maybe 30 years of sawdust had worn thin. The doctors called it frontotemporal dementia at first, then revised their diagnosis twice. By the end, they stopped trying to name it. What I noticed was simpler. Meredith, who had looked at me with such focus that first day at the antique shop, stopped meeting my eyes. I worked longer hours, took more jobs. If I could afford better treatments, maybe she'd look at me again. I sold my father's 1962 Chevrolet pickup to cover a specialist's bill. The truck had sat in the boathouse garage for 12 years after he passed, and I'd been maintaining it the way he taught me, keeping the engine clean, the chrome polished, the bench seat conditioned with neatsfoot oil. It was the only vehicle he ever owned. I got $14,000 for it. The engine hummed the same way it had when my father taught me to drive. I handed over the keys and walked home along the lake. 3 months later, I found the receipt. Meredith had paid that bill already 6 weeks before I sold the truck. She hadn't told me. I never asked why. Her final weeks, I slept in a chair beside her bed. She'd wake in the night, see me there, and turn her face to the wall. I thought she was ashamed of what she'd married. I thought she couldn't bear to look at the hands that had built everything she was leaving behind. What I didn't see, her fingers moving beneath the blankets, writing in a leather journal she hid whenever I stirred. The morning of the will reading, 3 weeks after we buried her, I put on my best flannel and my father's vintage Timex. The watch had a worn leather band and a scratch across the crystal from a workbench accident in 1987. I'd never had it serviced, didn't trust anyone else with the mechanism. I expected nothing from the estate. The mansion, the investments, the jewelry, those were Kristen's world. What I hoped for was smaller. A letter. A few lines explaining why Meredith had stopped seeing me. Some acknowledgement that 33 years had mattered. Attorney Donaldson's office was in a converted Victorian on Church Street. Second floor, wood-paneled walls, the smell of old paper and leather and furniture polish. The kind of space where old money came to be divided. I climbed the stairs. My hands were calloused. 33 years of work, visible in every scar and callus. Kristen and Bradley were already seated when I arrived. She wore cream cashmere. He wore a suit that cost more than my truck had sold for. Neither of them looked at me when I took the empty chair. The erosion started before I could name it. Small things, easy to dismiss. Thanksgiving 2019. I drove to our house with a pecan pie from Baker's Edge, the shop Meredith and I had visited every holiday for 20 years. The driveway was empty. No cars. No lights in the windows. I checked my phone. Nothing from Kristen. Nothing from Meredith. I called my wife. "We're at Bradley's family place," she said. Her voice was distant, the kind of distance that came from holding the phone away from her mouth so others wouldn't hear. "Didn't Kristen tell you?" "No, she didn't." A pause. "I'm sure it was just an oversight. You can still make it if you leave now. I'll text you the address." 2 hours to Connecticut. I drove with the pie on the passenger seat, the smell of brown sugar filling the cab. When I arrived, a valet took my truck keys with raised eyebrows. The Walsh estate had columns and a circular drive and more square footage than the house I'd spent 15 years restoring. "Clive," Bradley said when I found the dining room. He didn't stand. "You made it. We saved you a seat." The seat was at the far end of a table set for 18, between Bradley's great aunt and a cousin's girlfriend who spent the meal on her phone. Kristen sat at the center, next to her mother, and didn't look my direction once. I ate my pie alone in the kitchen afterward, standing at the counter while the catering staff cleaned around me. 3 months later, the charity auction, the Burlington Historical Society's annual gala, black tie, the kind of event where my restored furniture sometimes appeared in the catalog. That year, a federal period table I'd spent 8 months bringing back from near ruin was Lot 47. Mahogany, original brasses, a provenance tracing to a Philadelphia workshop in 1790. I wore my auction suit, the one I'd bought for estate sales 20 years ago, still serviceable, still fitting, because I'd lost weight during Meredith's first round of tests. Bradley bid on the table. He stood in the third row with Kristen, paddle raised, competing against a dealer from Boston I'd worked with for years. The price climbed. 12,000, 20, 35. Bradley won at $40,000, and the room applauded. The air smelled of champagne and furniture polish and too much perfume. The society president approached him for photographs. Bradley posed with his hand on the table's surface. "My father's a craftsman," I heard Kristen tell someone nearby. She laughed. "Well, a handyman, really." "He's very good with his hands." Bradley shook the president's hand. The photographer asked if he wanted to say a few words about the acquisition. "I restored that table," I said from behind them. Bradley turned. His smile didn't waver. "Of course you did. That's why I bought it." The photographer looked between us. Bradley's hand found my shoulder. Clive does excellent work, he said. We're lucky to have him in the family. The camera flashed. In the photo that appeared in the society newsletter, Bradley stood beside the table with his arm around my shoulders. The caption identified him as the generous donor. My name appeared nowhere. The awards came down in April. I'd hung them in the living room 15 years ago. Vermont Preservation Trust, recognition for the Whitfield House restoration, a feature in fine woodworking on my dovetail technique, a letter of commendation from the Smithsonian's Furniture Conservation Department, small frames, tastefully arranged. I came downstairs that Thursday morning and found Kristen on a stepladder. The garden club's coming at 2, she said. She held my fine woodworking frame in her hands. We need the wall space for Bradley's things. His things. Bloomberg did a profile last month. She gestured toward a stack of magazines on the coffee table, and the Times covered his fund's performance. These will look much better. I watched her replace my father's letter, the one he'd written when I completed my first solo restoration at 18, with a glossy photograph of Bradley shaking hands with a senator. 15 years of my awards, gone in 5 minutes. Kristen, I said. She stepped down from the ladder. Her cream cashmere caught the morning light. Her eyes met mine briefly, then moved past. The club members appreciate success, Father. They understand finance. They don't really care about furniture. She gathered my frames into a cardboard box and left them by the garage door. The financial statements started arriving that summer, envelopes addressed to Bradley Walsh at our address. I asked Meredith about them. It's handled, she said. We were in the kitchen, and she didn't look up from her tea. Bradley knows about these things. Estate planning. Our estate? The family's estate. She stirred her cup. He's protecting us, Clive. Trust me. The envelopes kept coming. In September, contractors arrived at the house without my knowledge. I came home from a consultation in Montpelier to find 3 men in my living room, measuring my staircase. Kristen stood with them, pointing at the balustrade I'd carved over 2 winters, matching the original 1890s pattern from a single surviving photograph. These will be replaced, she said. She's ordered replacements. I set down my tool bag. What's wrong with these? They look dated. She didn't turn around. The designer says clean lines are better for resale value. Resale? Eventually. She waved her hand. When you and Mother are gone, the contractors installed machine-cut replicas the following week. I found my original balustrades in a dumpster behind the garage. I salvaged 2 spindles before the truck came. They're still in my workshop, wrapped in cloth. Meredith's birthday dinner. October came fast. The dining room I'd restored, the table I'd built, the chairs I'd caned by hand. Bradley sat at the head. I have an announcement, he said. He raised his wine glass. I've restructured the family assets into a trust. The mansion, the investments, everything is protected now. Protected from what? I asked. Bradley smiled. Taxes. Lawsuits. What about the boathouse? The table went quiet. Kristen's hand found Bradley's arm. That shack? Bradley laughed. It wasn't unkind. It was dismissive. The complete absence of cruelty, which was worse. We'll tear it down eventually. The waterfront access alone is worth the demolition cost. My father built that boathouse. I know. Bradley sipped his wine. It's a liability, Clive. The foundation's probably rotted through. Better to clear it and develop the shore. Kristen nodded. Her lips curved the same way as her husband's. I finished my dinner in silence. The final weeks came fast. Meredith's decline accelerated after Christmas. The doctors stopped predicting timelines. I stopped sleeping in our bedroom and moved a chair beside her hospital bed in the guest room. Every night, I sat there, watching her breathe, waiting for her to need something, water, a blanket adjustment, anything I could provide. She'd wake in the small hours, and I'd see her eyes find me in the dim light. Then she'd turn away, face to the wall, shoulders drawing up as if my presence was something to endure. The calluses, the sawdust, the man who built things instead of managing money. 33 years, and she couldn't look at me. Sometimes, during my brief naps in the chair, I'd startle awake and see her hands moving beneath the blankets. I assumed discomfort, pain, the body's small rebellions against its failure. She'd stop when she heard me stir. Her hands would go still. Her eyes would close. I never asked what she was doing. A leather journal appeared on her nightstand in those final days. Small, brown, with worn corners. She'd pull it under the covers when I entered the room, and I'd pretend not to notice. Everyone deserves their privacy, even the dying, especially the dying. The last time she spoke to me directly was 3 days before the end. I brought her tea, Earl Grey, weak, the way she'd always taken it. "Clive," she said. I set the cup on her nightstand. "I'm here." Her eyes found mine. Something moved behind them, something I couldn't read. Then she looked away. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." I held her hand at the end. She didn't squeeze back. Attorney Donaldson's office smelled like furniture polish and old money. Vermont cherry paneling, mid-century mahogany desk, leather chairs worn smooth by decades of difficult conversations. I noticed these things because noticing is what I do, even now. Even walking into the room where my marriage would be reduced to a list of assets. Kristen and Bradley were already seated when I entered. Neither rose. Bradley's charcoal suit cost more than my father's truck had sold for. Kristen wore cream cashmere, her posture rigid, her attention fixed on her manicure. The diamond on her left hand threw rainbows across the leather armrest. I could see my work truck parked beside their Mercedes. The contrast said everything the room wouldn't. I took the empty chair. I wore my best flannel, the one I saved for estate auctions and funerals. It felt thin against the weight of the room. 3 weeks since we buried Meredith. 3 weeks of phone calls I didn't answer, of meals I didn't eat, of sleep that wouldn't come. The Timex on my wrist had belonged to my father. The scratch across its crystal came from a Workbench accident in 1987. I never trusted anyone else with the mechanism. Attorney Donaldson, Meredith's estate lawyer for the past decade, opened a leather folder on his desk. He was 62, gray at the temples, with the kind of neutral expression that came from reading bad news to families for 30 years. "Shall we begin?" he asked. No one answered. He began anyway, the last will and testament of Meredith Ann Thornbury. His voice was professional, detached. The words meant nothing to him beyond their legal weight. "To my daughter Kristen, I leave the property at 742 Lakeshore Road, including all structures, furnishings, and improvements thereto." The mansion. 15 years of restoration. Every mantel I'd carved, every floor I'd laid, every window I'd reglazed. The curved staircase balustrade Kristen had already replaced with machine-cut replicas. Bradley's hand found his wife's arm. She didn't look at me. Additionally, to Kristen, I leave both vehicles registered in my name. The Mercedes Meredith drove to her appointments. The Volvo she'd kept for sentimental reasons. The same car we'd brought Kristen home from the hospital in 32 years ago. All investment accounts held in my name, totaling $890,000, shall transfer to Kristen upon my death. 890,000. The number hung in the air. Bradley's satisfied nod confirmed he'd expected this outcome. Probably helped engineer it. Finally, to Kristen, I leave my jewelry collection, including but not limited to my grandmother's diamond ensemble, the diamonds, the ones Meredith wore to every anniversary dinner for 33 years, the ones she'd promised years ago would stay in the family. They would, just not my part of the family. Donaldson paused. His eyes lifted from the document and found mine for a moment. Something passed between us that I couldn't read. Then he continued, "To my husband Clive, I leave the property at 807 Lakeshore Road." The boathouse. Bradley snorted. The sound wasn't malicious. It was dismissive. The complete absence of cruelty, which was worse. Kristen's thin smile widened. She turned in her chair, looked directly at me. "Well, Father," she said, "I hope you enjoy the termites." The words landed like a physical blow. I felt my shoulders tighten. My hands gripped the armrests. My knuckles went white. I forced my fingers to release. The leather was good quality. Someone had maintained it properly. I noticed this because noticing is what I do, even now. I said nothing. Donaldson continued reading. Executor provisions, tax implications, legal formalities. I stopped listening. The room had gone distant, the voices muffled, like hearing conversation through water. $890,000. The mansion, the cars, the jewelry, everything visible, everything that could be photographed and appraised and displayed. And Clive gets the boathouse. Bradley shifted in his chair. He straightened his tie, adjusted his cuffs. The gestures of a man wrapping up a successful negotiation. "We'll need you to remove your personal effects from the property within 72 hours, he said. His voice was casual. "Business as usual. We're having the locks changed this weekend." 72 hours. 3 days to vacate the home I'd built. Kristen gathered her Hermes bag. Bradley helped her with her coat. Cream wool, tailored. Probably cost more than my monthly income. I sat in the leather chair and watched them prepare to leave. I forced myself to let go of the armrests. Donaldson rose from behind his desk, shook Bradley's hand, thanked Kristen for her patience during this difficult time. His voice remained professional, neutral, revealing nothing. Then he turned to me. "Mr. Thornbury," he said, "a moment, if you don't mind." Bradley and Kristen were already at the door. They didn't look back. Donaldson reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. His own card, cream stock, embossed lettering. He pressed it into my palm. There was writing on the back, "Call me after you visited the property." I looked at him. His expression stayed neutral, but his eyes held something I couldn't name. Not pity. Something else. I pocketed the card without reading the message. Too numb to wonder why. Too broken to notice the attention he was paying me. The door closed behind Kristen and Bradley. Their footsteps faded down the stairs. I watched them cross to the Mercedes. Bradley opened Kristen's door. She slid inside without glancing back at the building. They drove away. I sat in the leather chair for another 10 minutes. Donaldson returned to his desk, shuffled papers, made notes. He didn't rush me, didn't speak, just let me sit with the weight of what had happened. My father built the boathouse in 1962, post and beam construction with hand-cut joinery, techniques already becoming rare when power tools dominated the trade. I'd spent summers there as a boy learning to identify wood by smell, learning that what you do when nobody's looking is who you are. The foundation was probably rotted through. Bradley had said so at Meredith's birthday dinner. The waterfront access alone is worth the demolition cost. Termites. I stood. My legs felt unsteady. The room seemed smaller than when I'd entered. "Thank you," I said to Donaldson. I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for. He nodded. The card was still in my pocket, the handwritten message unread. I drove to the boathouse that night. The back roads were empty, the lake silver in the fading light. My work truck knew the way. I'd made this drive 1,000 times over the years, bringing supplies to maintain the property, keeping the place alive because my father had built it with his hands. I didn't want to go back to the mansion, didn't want to sort through 33 years of marriage under the 72-hour deadline. Didn't want to beg for time from people who saw me as an embarrassment. At least I could grieve here, among my father's ghost. The hinges didn't creak. I stood in the doorway, my hand still on the brass knob my father had installed in 1962, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The floor shone, not the flat look of neglect covered by dust, but the warm luster of hardwood properly maintained. Someone had been waxing these floors recently. I stepped inside. The windows were clean. Late afternoon light poured through them, catching the grain patterns in the cedar paneling my father had selected 60 years ago. The air smelled like lemon oil, coffee, and the faint sweetness of wild trillium. Coffee. On the kitchen table, 2 white mugs sat steaming. Between them, a small vase held trillium and violets, the kind that grew along the shoreline path. Someone had picked them this morning. A wall calendar hung beside the refrigerator. I crossed the room and stood before it. Today's date was circled in red marker. Beneath the circle, in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, Meredith had written, "He finally came home." My wife's handwriting, on a calendar in a building she'd never shown any interest in visiting. A knock came from the doorway behind me. I turned. A woman stood on the threshold, 74, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and sharp blue eyes that studied me with something like relief. She wore canvas pants and a gardening shirt with soil stains on the elbows. "You must be Clive," she said. "I'm Helen Mayweather. I live in the cottage up the path." "Meredith's neighbor," I said. "The antiques dealer." Helen nodded. "Retired now, but yes." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, moving with the confidence of someone who'd been in this space many times before. "Your wife and I were friends for 40 years. She asked me to maintain this place while you were otherwise occupied. 2 years of watching Meredith die. 3 weeks of grief and eviction notices. I don't understand," I said. "Meredith never mentioned. She wouldn't have." Helen moved to the coffee mugs and lifted one, wrapping her hands around it. "Not until you were ready. Not until you came here yourself." "Ready for what?" Helen set down her mug and walked to the main room, where a worn Persian rug covered the center of the floor. The rug had belonged to my parents. I remembered it from childhood. The faded geometric patterns, the frayed edges where my mother's cats had sharpened their claws. Helen knelt and rolled back one corner. Beneath it, a brass ring lay flush with the floorboards. "Your father installed this in 1962, Helen said. "Did he ever show you?" I stared at the ring, the trap door. I'd known about it as a child, vaguely, the way children know about crawl spaces and attics without ever exploring them. My father had used it for storage. Old tools, things he didn't need but couldn't discard. Helen pulled the ring. The trapdoor lifted on well-oiled hinges, showing a steep wooden staircase descending into darkness. She reached for a switch mounted on the wall inside. Light filled the space below. Not the dim yellow of old bulbs, but the clean white of professional archival lighting. "Go on," Helen said. "She knows you'll understand." I descended. The basement opened before me, larger than I'd expected. 1,200 square feet at least, the ceiling reinforced with steel beams that hadn't been here when I was a child. Someone had transformed this space. Climate-controlled air circulated from vents I could hear humming in the walls. Humidity gauges mounted on support columns showed readings in the museum safe range. UV filtering panels covered the light fixtures and the furniture. 18 pieces stood arranged throughout the space like an exhibition, each wrapped in moving blankets and acid-free paper. I approached the nearest one, my hands moving before my mind could catch up, pulling back the covering. My fingers stopped. Gustav Stickley, a sideboard with hammered copper hardware and quarter-sawn oak construction, the grain straight and even, the original finish intact beneath a century of careful preservation. I knew this piece. I'd seen it photographed in collector's guides, discussed in restoration journals. The last authenticated Stickley sideboard had sold at Christie's for $180,000. I moved to the next piece, Chippendale Highboy, Philadelphia School, the brasses, original and unpolished. I ran my hand along the side panel. The wood spoke to my fingers before my eyes made sense of the joinery. Hand-cut dovetails with the slight irregularities that distinguished 18th century work from modern reproductions. 220,000 at minimum, maybe more with the right provenance documentation. The third piece stopped me cold. A Federal period secretary desk, mahogany case with inlaid stringing, the writing surface showing decades of careful use. I ran my hand along the side panel, felt the grain, brought my face close and inhaled. American chestnut, pre-blight wood, harvested before 1904 when the fungus began killing 4 billion trees. My father had kept samples of this lumber, treasured them like holy relics. The species was extinct now as a commercial timber. Furniture made from old-growth chestnut was priceless in ways that transcended market value. I checked the interior hardware. The hinges bore the faint stamp of a Boston workshop I recognized from my research. The proportions matched pieces attributed to Thomas Seymour, and there, on the underside of a drawer, the careful script of an Addams family inventory number. $340,000. Conservative estimate. My fingers trembled against the wood grain. I moved through the remaining pieces. A Martha Washington sewing cabinet, a Philadelphia lowboy with original shell carvings, a set of 6 Hepplewhite dining chairs with their needlepoint seats still intact, 15 more pieces of museum-quality antiques, each one documented with certificates of authenticity visible in protective sleeves attached to the wrapping. The combined value of these remaining pieces approached $500,000. On a small desk in the corner sat a leathered journal I recognized, the same journal Meredith had hidden under her blankets during those final weeks, the same one she'd pull beneath the covers whenever I stirred in my chair. Beside it lay a cream envelope with Attorney Donaldson's letterhead visible through the paper. I picked up the journal and opened to the first entry. Bradley thinks, "I don't see what he's doing." The statements he sends to himself instead of Clive. the trust documents that put everything in his name. He believes I'm too sick to notice. He's wrong. I turned pages. Meredith's handwriting filled entry after entry, her observations growing sharper as her body failed. June 15th, Bradley's hedge fund is hemorrhaging money. He's been covering losses with client funds, moving numbers around, buying time. The Thornbury estate is his lifeline. He's convinced Kristen that her father is the embarrassment. But the embarrassment is that she believed him. July 22nd. Helen found the Stickley at an estate sale in Connecticut. The family had no idea what they were selling. I used the reverse mortgage money, the one Bradley never investigated because he assumed I was too confused to understand financial documents. $200,000, hidden in plain sight. September 3rd. The Adams desk arrived today. Helen authenticated it herself before the auction. She bid by phone so no one would connect it to me. $340,000 of Bradley's expected inheritance, converted into something Clive will recognize on sight. November 12th. The basement is finished. Climate control, archival conditions, everything a conservator could want. Clive will understand when he sees it. He always sees what others miss. That's why I married him. I set down the journal and reached for the envelope. Inside, a 3-page letter from Donaldson explained what Meredith had done. The boathouse deed included riparian rights, not just the structure, but water access extending 150 feet into Lake Champlain. These rights had been separated from the main estate in 1962 when my father built the boathouse on land he purchased from a different owner. The rights were never reunified. The mansion had lake frontage, 300 feet of shoreline that looked spectacular in real estate photographs. But the deeds showed no boat launch privileges, no dock rights, no water access whatsoever. The only legal boat launch for half a mile belonged to the boathouse. Kristen had inherited a landlocked property, 3 acres of lakefront that couldn't reach the lake, a mansion worth far less than she believed, burdened with a reverse mortgage that came due in 90 days. Property taxes 3 years delinquent, and a husband whose hedge fund was about to collapse. I looked at the furniture standing around me, $1.2 million in authenticated antiques, transferred through Helen's dealer network, purchased with reverse mortgage funds Bradley never traced, stored in a climate-controlled workshop he dismissed as termite food. Meredith hadn't rejected me. She'd protected me. The coldness in her final months wasn't disappointment. It was discipline. The distance wasn't shame. It was strategy. Every time she turned her face to the wall, she was hiding the journal where she documented how to save me from the family that wanted me gone. I picked up the journal again and turned to the final entry. He'll understand. He always sees what others miss. That's why I married him. I stood in the basement my father built and my wife transformed with treasures only I would recognize arranged around me, and understood everything I'd missed for 2 years. 3 months ago, I would have walked away. Not anymore. Meredith saw me. That was enough. Bradley Walsh called my disconnected landline 17 times in 4 days. I know because I checked the voicemail from Helen's cottage, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee going cold, while his messages grew increasingly desperate. The first call came Tuesday morning. Clive, we need to discuss the property situation. Call me back. Professional. Controlled. By Tuesday evening, his voice cracked on the word clarification. He repeated my attorneys twice. There's been some confusion about the estate documents. My attorneys need clarification on certain details. Call me. Wednesday brought 4 messages before noon. The reverse mortgage, $340,000 due in 90 days. How did you know about this? What did Meredith tell you? His final voicemail arrived Thursday at 6 a.m. I listened to it twice. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but the mansion has lake frontage. My real estate attorney says your boathouse property controls the water access. That can't be right. It can't be legal. Call me back, Clive. We need to talk. I set down the phone. Helen Mayweather, Meredith's neighbor and retired antiques dealer, poured more coffee. They'll come this afternoon, she said. I know. Are you ready? I thought about the documents spread across my kitchen table. 3 auction house appraisals. Ownership transfers with Meredith's notarized signature. Certificates of authenticity for 18 pieces of museum-quality furniture. Attorney Donaldson's letter explaining the riparian rights my father secured in 1962. Yes, I said. I'm ready. Bradley's Mercedes appeared on the lake road at 2:15. I watched from the boathouse window as it pulled up beside Donaldson's sedan and Helen's practical station wagon. Bradley killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the other vehicles. I returned to the kitchen table and waited. Bradley pushed open the front door without knocking. He entered first, still wearing his conference room confidence like armor. Kristen followed in cream cashmere, the same outfit she'd worn to the will reading. Bradley's eyes swept past the clean windows, past the polished floors, and fixed on me. Attorney Donaldson, Meredith's estate lawyer who'd orchestrated this meeting, sat to my left, a laptop closed in front of him. Helen occupied the chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap. The coffee mugs from that first morning had been replaced with documents, appraisal forms, transfer papers, legal correspondence. The evidence of what Meredith had done, arranged in neat stacks across the surface my father had built. Bradley stopped 3 feet from the table. His suit cost more than my truck. His hands were shaking. What is this? He asked. This is what Meredith left me, I said. His eyes moved across the papers. The auction house letterheads, the 6-figure estimates. His face went through several expressions in quick succession. Confusion, recognition, something approaching panic. These are fraudulent, he said. His voice had gone tight. She was mentally incompetent. These transfers won't hold up. I slid the nearest appraisal across the table. Gustav Stickley's sideboard. Estimated value, $180,000. Bradley's hand trembled as he picked it up. 3 separate auction houses, I said. Christie's, Sotheby's, Skinner. They all examined the pieces. They all authenticated them. Those aren't estimates, Bradley. Those are guaranteed minimum bids. He turned pages. The Chippendale Highboy, the Addams Family Secretary Desk, the Martha Washington Cabinet. His lips moved as he calculated. 1.2 million total, spread across 18 pieces of furniture he'd dismissed as termite food. Mother would never, Kristen started. Her voice had climbed to a register I hadn't heard since she was 17 and didn't get her way. Attorney Donaldson opened his laptop. Mrs. Thornbury anticipated that response, he said. His voice carried the same professional neutrality from the will reading, but now it served a different purpose. She recorded a video deposition 6 months before her death. He turned the screen toward Bradley and Kristen. Meredith's face filled the frame. The laptop's small speakers carrying her voice across the kitchen my father had built. She sat in a high-backed chair I recognized from Donaldson's office. Her eyes were clear. Her voice was steady. The date stamp showed March 15th of last year. "My name is Meredith Ann Thornbury," she said. "I am of sound mind and making this statement freely. My son-in-law Bradley Walsh has been systematically repositioning our family assets into trusts he controls. He believes I am too ill to notice. He is wrong." Kristen made a sound like she'd been struck. "Over the past 18 months, I have transferred our most valuable possessions to a secure location my husband will recognize. Bradley wanted the mansion, the cars, the investment accounts. He can have them. He can also have the reverse mortgage I took out against the property, $340,000, due 90 days after my death." Bradley's face had gone gray. "The property taxes are 3 years delinquent," Meredith continued. "The roof needs replacement. The foundation has drainage issues. Clive identified last year, but was told not to fix because Bradley thought it was unnecessary spending. The mansion's debts nearly equal its value. Bradley, if you're watching this, you got exactly what you deserved." She paused. Her eyes seemed to find the camera lens with intention. "Kristen, you stopped seeing your father years ago. You let Bradley convince you that his calloused hands were something to be ashamed of. You were wrong. Clive built everything you took for granted. Every mantle, every floor, every window. And now he has the only thing that really mattered, the truth." The video ended. Bradley's breathing was the only sound. Then Kristen's heel scraped the floor. Bradley stood motionless, the appraisal still in his hand. Christine had pressed both palms against the table as if she needed support to remain upright. The cream cashmere showed a coffee stain near the hem I hadn't noticed before. "This won't stand," Bradley said. His voice had lost its boardroom authority. "I'll file a challenge. Mental incompetence. Undue influence. I'll tie this up in court for years." "Mr. Walsh," Donaldson said, "the video includes detailed documentation of your financial activities, the client fund transfers, the asset repositioning, the loans secured against properties you didn't own." Mrs. Thornbury was quite thorough in her observations. "That's—" Bradley stopped. Started again. "Those are private business matters. They're evidence." My voice stayed level. The same voice I used when explaining wood grain to an apprentice. The same patience I used selecting tools. "Meredith gathered it for 2 years. She knew what you were doing. She knew what you were planning, and she made sure I would have protection when you came after what was left." Bradley's hand closed around the appraisal, crumpling the edge. Kristen reached for his arm. "We should go." Her voice barely reached across the table. "Bradley." He stared at me across the table my father built. The man who'd called me a handyman at charity auctions. The man who'd had my awards taken off the walls. The man who'd planned to tear down the boathouse for its waterfront access. The waterfront access he now desperately needed and could never have. "You planned this," he said. "No!" Meredith planned this. I just finally saw what she was doing. He dropped the appraisal onto the table, turned, walked toward the door without looking back. Kristen followed, her heels clicking against my father's hardwood floors. At the threshold, she paused. I waited for her to say something, an accusation, a threat, an apology. She said nothing. The door closed behind them. Through the window, gravel crunched under Bradley's tires as the Mercedes backed out of the driveway. He drove too fast, kicking up stones. The car disappeared around the bend in the lake road. Helen released a long breath. Donaldson closed his laptop. We'll need to file the transfer documents with the county clerk this week, the riparian rights registration as well. I nodded. My hands rested flat on the table, steady as they'd always been. My shoulders dropped. The tension in my neck eased for the first time in weeks. The Timex my father gave me ticked against my wrist. The morning light came through clean windows, catching the grain in my father's cedar paneling. Somewhere below my feet, $1.2 million in authenticated antiques waited in climate-controlled darkness. My wife had given me everything that mattered. It just took me 33 years to see it. 6 months after the confrontation, the ledger balanced itself. Attorney Donaldson called on a Tuesday morning in October. The mansion sold at auction yesterday, he said. Final price was $1.1 million. I set down my coffee. The boathouse kitchen caught morning light through windows I'd cleaned myself the day before. And the debts? The reverse mortgage took $340,000. I waited. Delinquent property taxes came to $87,000 with penalties. He paused. I could hear papers shuffling. Legal fees, closing costs, transferred taxes. How much remained? When the title company finished, the remaining balance was $11,400. Kristen inherited a mansion worth over $1 million. She walked away with enough to cover 2 months of Greenwich rent. Bradley's hedge fund collapsed 3 weeks later in early November. Helen Mayweather, the retired antiques dealer who'd maintained the boathouse for Meredith, brought the news herself. She walked up the path from her cottage with a copy of the Wall Street Journal tucked under her arm and spread it across my kitchen table. Walsh Capital Partners, Investor Fraud Investigation. Assets frozen pending federal review. Bradley's litigation threats during our confrontation had been recorded by Donaldson as a matter of professional documentation. When Bradley's investors heard he was threatening lawsuits over a family estate, they requested a routine audit. The audit revealed the same irregularities Meredith had documented in her journal. He'd been moving client money to cover losses since 2019, Helen said. The Thornbury estate was supposed to be his bailout. Without it, the whole structure fell apart. I studied the photograph accompanying the article. Bradley Walsh, leaving a federal building, one hand raised against cameras, his $1,000 suit wrinkled in a way I'd never seen. The man who called me a handyman at charity auctions now had his professional life printed in newsprint for anyone to read. I folded the paper and handed it back. Anything else? Helen nodded. Kristen filed for divorce last week. In Greenwich Family Court. Public record. The marriage lasted 4 months past the will reading. Long enough for Kristen to discover what Bradley had hidden in those financial statements he'd insisted on controlling. Bradley had been stealing from Kristen's expected inheritance for 2 years before Meredith died. The same greed that drove his schemes had been bleeding. The Walsh family accounts dry. The antiques community spread the truth faster than any newspaper could. Helen had spent 40 years building relationships with auction houses, collectors, and dealers across New England. She didn't orchestrate revenge. She simply told the true story to people who knew how to talk. A Christie specialist told a Boston Globe reporter. The family wealth came from Clive's labor. The daughter never understood that. The Greenwich social circuit that once courted Bradley and Kristen began closing doors. Dinner invitations stopped. Country club memberships came up for renewal and weren't renewed. The same people who'd witnessed Kristen's sneer at the will reading now watched her fall with the same polite distance they'd once reserved for service staff. The genealogy story broke in late November. Helen's journalist contact, a features writer for Connecticut magazine, had been researching the antiques angle when she stumbled onto something better. The dealer who'd sold Kristen her fabricated baronet documents agreed to cooperate. He produced receipts, emails, and the original template he'd used to forge the ancestry papers. For 3 years, Kristen had claimed connection to a minor English baronet on her Instagram. The posts featured sepia-toned photographs of manor houses and careful hints about noble blood. Her Greenwich friends had found it charming. The article included screenshots. Her Instagram posts about noble blood were captured and shared across the communities that remembered every snub, every dismissal, every time Kristen had called her father's work embarrassing. Her fabricated ancestry became a viral joke within circles that measured status by authenticity. Helen brought updates with morning coffee. I listened the way I listened to weather reports. Facts to be noted. Conditions to be understood. Nothing to be done. The final image arrived in December. Donaldson forwarded a photograph from the courthouse steps. Kristen walking alone toward a leased sedan, her cream cashmere replaced by something darker, more practical. No Mercedes, no Bradley, no cluster of society friends offering support. The same courthouse where Greenwich families gathered for charity galas and social registrations had watched her sign divorce papers in a room that smelled of old paper and disappointment. I studied the photograph for a long time. Her posture had changed. The rigid deportment from finishing school had softened into something closer to exhaustion. Her face carried lines I didn't remember. She looked, for the first time since childhood, like she might understand what it meant to lose something that couldn't be replaced. I sat at my father's workbench that evening, a piece of cherry wood in my hands. The grain was straight and even. I ran my thumb along it, feeling the subtle ridges. Then I set it aside, pulled out a sheet of paper, and wrote one letter. Dear Kristen, your mother left you everything she thought you deserved. She was right about both of us. Your father. I sealed the envelope and walked it to the mailbox at the end of the lake road. The December air smelled of frozen water and wood smoke. My father's Timex ticked against my wrist, the same steady rhythm it had kept for 53 years. I didn't expect a response. I didn't receive one. The boathouse stood solid against the winter wind. Inside, 18 pieces of museum-quality furniture waited in climate-controlled darkness. Outside, the lake had frozen in patterns that caught afternoon light like cut glass. Helen stopped by that evening with a bottle of wine and news that Bradley's federal indictment would be announced in January. White-collar crimes, securities fraud, misrepresentation of assets. The Connecticut old money he'd married into had already distanced themselves. His family's Greenwich compound was in foreclosure. I poured 2 glasses and we sat by the window, watching the last light fade over the lake. Do you feel vindicated? Helen asked. I considered the question. The word implied I'd been seeking revenge. I hadn't. I'd been seeking clarity, understanding what Meredith had done and why. The rest was mathematics. I feel grateful, I said. She saw me. Helen raised her glass. To Meredith, to Meredith. The wine was good. The company was better. Through the window, I could see the constellation Orion rising over the Adirondacks. The same stars my father had pointed out when he taught me to navigate by night. Some debts settle themselves. Some ledgers balance without intervention. And some people discover too late that the parts they dismissed as worthless were the only parts that mattered. Loving this so far? Smash like and rate my story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Thank you for being here. 18 months after the will reading, I stood at my father's workbench, watching the morning light move across cedar paneling he'd installed 60 years ago. Marcus Chen, 23 and fresh from a furniture conservation program in Boston, fit his first dovetail joint. His hands trembled the same way mine had when my father first let me hold the chisel. Beside him, Sarah Okonchwo, my second apprentice and a cabinet maker's granddaughter from Ghana, held the stock steady without being asked. They represented something I'd never been able to give Kristen, a craft worth learning, a legacy worth continuing. The workshop had grown since that first morning when I found 2 coffee mugs waiting. I'd sold the Stickley sideboard at $190,000, the Martha Washington cabinet at $110,000, and a set of Hepplewhite chairs for $385,000. Enough to install proper climate control, expand the teaching space, and restore what my father built to what it deserved to be. Close, I said. Not quite there yet. Show me. Marcus handed me the pieces. The joint was clean, the angles precise, but I could feel the gap before I saw it. Hairline, maybe a 32nd of an inch. Here. I pointed to the baseline. You're rushing the cut. Let the saw do the work. Sarah nodded. Her grandfather told her the same thing she'd said once. Tools have patience. People don't. The kitchen door opened. Helen Mayweather, still in her gardening clothes despite the morning chill, carried 2 mugs of coffee. She set one beside my elbow without asking if I wanted it. The society called, she said. They're ready for the installation. Next Tuesday. I'll drive it myself. The curator had already approved the plaque wording. The Addams family secretary desk would leave the workshop in 6 days. The Vermont Historical Society had accepted my donation, with the single condition I'd requested, a small brass plaque reading in honor of Meredith Thornbury, who understood that some things are worth protecting. Helen's eyes moved to the framed calendar on the kitchen wall, Meredith's handwriting still visible behind museum glass. He finally came home. She always saw you, Helen said. I set down my coffee and reached into the drawer beneath the workbench. My fingers found the small block of American chestnut, harvested before the blight killed 4 billion trees. 31904 wood. Survivors. You can tell a man's character by how he treats the parts no one will ever see. I held the chestnut to my face and breathed in honey and moss. The weight of it settled in my palm, solid and warm. Through the window, Lake Champlain stretched toward the Adirondacks under spring light. Marcus and Sarah worked at the bench Curtis built in 1962, their movements finding rhythm. Helen poured coffee. Steam rose. The lake stretched silver toward the mountains. Meredith saw me. That was enough.